Hello and welcome back to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that will piss your uncle off. It's a Sunday episode. We're going to get into some social theory, some political thought, but first, before we start talking about the Vietnam syndrome, the GWOT syndrome, or the global war on terror syndrome, and Iran, we're going to talk about news. And you might be like, "Oh, what are you guys actually talking about?" Well, you stick around to find out. So it's Sunday. Last night or early this morning, Haifa got hit, military target. At least what we're hearing is 30 casualties from a Hezbollah rocket shot at or around the port of Haifa. Here is the footage. So we're seeing a lot of litters, a lot of stretchers. We're not sure. We're not currently seeing a lot of blood, so we could kind of maybe it was like a lot of TBIs, concussions from the overpressure from the blast. We don't see any battle damage, but it's definitely not a drill. Line of about 15 ambulances. Looks pretty serious. Haven't heard anything about military deaths. So that happened. We can expect the situation to escalate from here. Now, as we talk about escalation, we can talk about U.S. involvement. And this is a recent development breaking about an hour and a half ago. And this coincides with the missile attack. The United States is about to send Israel an air defense battery, a THAAD battery, along with American troops to help bolster its defense against Iran. Generally, each THAAD, that's terminal high altitude, crap, I don't have the acronym up here. Let me pull it up just so we can have it. THAAD system, terminal high altitude area defense battery, and it consists of about 6 truck-mounted launchers, 48 interceptors, radio and radar equipment, and requires 95 soldiers to operate. The U.S. does not want the bloodshed to end. It wants to secure its colony. A THAAD battery won't save Israel from a massed Iranian reprisal, but it's a nice symbolic gesture, and we're sending more troops to Israel to bolster its air defense system from short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles in their terminal phase, which means when they're coming down and about to land on target. So it won't get all of them, but it'll help boost their air defense system. So again, thanks y'all for listening. And we are on Patreon. And if you want to support us that way, that'd be awesome. If not, well, first of all, we do have exclusive content. Okay. We do work for a living, but if you can't because you're being nickeled and dimed, or you don't want to because late stage capitalism is a drag, we're just glad you're here. Like, share, and subscribe. Maybe leave a comment. Helps drive this in the algorithm so it gets out to more people. So today, Mark, what are we talking about?
So we're going to be following up on a discussion you and I had on Fuck Around Friday, which was on Friday, where I've been thinking a lot about how this conundrum that the U.S. government is in.
Sorry. Real quick, just for the audience, F Around Fridays is a segment we do on Patreon where we kind of joke about stuff and try to relieve the horrors of modern existence. So that is an exclusive thing on video. So in case you don't have any context for what that is, that's a once a week Friday video. Sorry, Mark.
No, it's all good. The great thing about F Around Fridays is that we sometimes chase a lot of different tangents. It's kind of a free-for-all. And as we explore them, we come up with kind of like new lines of thinking that maybe we should probably bring into the more mainstream version of our channel. And on that breath, we were talking about the Vietnam syndrome. I proposed a theory to Greg that we are in a new type of syndrome. So before I get into that new type of syndrome, I'm going to first give you guys a backdrop on what the Vietnam syndrome is. So as we witness the horror of Israel's desperate late-stage colonialism, the Palestinian and Lebanese people being its chief victims, and Washington elites showing no signs of abating their full support for genocide and full disregard for basic international law and bombing civilians, it appears, if we're to take Washington's rhetoric seriously, that war with Iran is far more desirable for our patriotic leaders than hurricane relief. There's just one problem getting in the way of that agenda: Americans. Rather than explain in full Captain Obvious style about what I mean, I think this video will do a better job of illustrating that in far more memorable verbiage.
Go to war for you! I'm a 100% disabled fucking veteran. And guess what they do when you get out? First they break you down and they brainwash you. And then they tell you, hey, you're a soldier now. You're an airman now. You're a Marine now. You're a sailor now. Stand with pride in your uniform that costs like $800 that you have to pay out of your own paycheck. They don't just give it to you. You gotta pay for it. And then after they brainwash you, they throw you the fuck in the trash. Nobody wants to go to war for you. You don't take care of the American people. You don't take care of the service members. And by God, you goddammit, don't fucking take care of the veterans. Fuck you.
Okay.
I love that. Oh, sorry. I love that video because it. So
we need to define the terms. So I'm going to do that real quick. So what this guy's rage is a part of is something that we used to call Vietnam syndrome. So Vietnam syndrome, and of course we've talked about Vietnam, the backlash, the war, the beginnings of anti-war movements in America. But the Vietnam syndrome is a term in U.S. politics that refers to public aversion to American overseas military involvements and actions after the domestic controversy over the Vietnam War. So in 1973, the U.S. ended combat operations in Vietnam. And since the early 1980s, some possible effects of Vietnam syndrome in terms of political thought included public opinion against war, ending active use of military conscription. That's gone. We're now a volunteer force after Vietnam. And a relative reluctance to deploy ground troops and a Vietnam paralysis. And this Vietnam syndrome is something that Republican war hawks and hawks on the Democratic side as well wanted to get rid of. So this journalist called Norman Podhoretz stated in a commentary saying, making the world safe for communism. He said, do we lack power? ? Certainly not if power is measured in brute terms of economic, technological, and military capacity. By those standards, we are still the most powerful country in the world. The issue boils down in the end to the question of will. And then after this, the Vietnam syndrome proliferated in the press and policy circles as a way of explaining the United States, one of the world's superpowers, failing to repel North Vietnam's invasion of South Vietnam. And so Ronald Reagan, made it his kind of mission to dispel the Vietnam syndrome from the public and foreign policy circles. So it begins with the invasion of Grenada, then our involvement in Desert Storm, and then, our involvement in Bosnia as well. And it was thought like in the 90s, after the victory against Saddam, the Vietnam syndrome was finally ended. Then 9/11 happened and we went to war on a massive scale all over again. And we were positing, just real quick to wrap up, we were positing in our episode of F Around Friday that there's a new stage of syndrome. It's what I called, and we want to officially term and coin here, the GWOT syndrome, the Global War on Terror syndrome. So after 20 years, 2 failed wars, interventions in the dirty war in Syria and Libya, bombing weddings in Yemen, and dropping Somalia, what did we accomplish? Nothing. Public opinion has turned against the military. We're in the largest recruiting crisis ever. Really ever, since the Vietnam War. And now the drums of war against Iran are banging again. So our simple premise for this conversation is Is the GWOT syndrome, which makes people averse to U.S. interventionism after Afghanistan and Iraq, finally coming to an end? Or are they just trying to make it, the war hawks, the Hillary Clintons, and to some extent like Trump, because he's actually not a anti-war candidate, especially when it comes to Iran. Are they trying to dispel this GWOT syndrome? Take it away, Mark.
I mean, I think you just read everything that I was going to say, but okay. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Greg. Jesus freaking Christ.
Well,
all right.
This is your.
I was going to go into a little bit more detail, but all right.
This is your rabbit hole.
You already went down it. We're not. All right. So, one of the contributors to the Vietnam syndrome was what is deemed the Pentagon Papers. So the Pentagon Papers refers to a declassified a classified U.S. Department of Defense study, officially titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. It was completed in 1969 and documented the history of U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The report became widely known after Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst, leaked it to the press in 1971. Can you think of a modern day parallel with that, Greg?
Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, a ton of stuff.
Julian Assange. So, skipping down to the WikiLeaks. So Chelsea Manning was sentenced to 35 years in prison. She and Julian Assange, they faced extradition under the Espionage Act for publishing classified information.
Yeah, and so the whole Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange thing went down when she was court-martialed and convicted under the Espionage Act was in 2013 after disclosing to WikiLeaks nearly 750,000 classified or unclassified but sensitive military and diplomatic documents. So I guess this is the modern day corollary to the Pentagon Papers.
Now, what was revealed in the Pentagon Papers and what was revealed in what Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning leaked, what was your knowledge, based on your experience in Afghanistan? How do you relate to what was leaked by Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning in regards to the Afghan war, the war crimes, the targeting of civilians, the ratio of actual militant targets that were hit versus civilian targets that were actually hit?
I honestly didn't pay that much attention to it because when that came out, I think she was convicted in July 2013. I was currently in Nangarhar province. No, I think I must have been in Logar province, and I was busy with other shit, and I was not really concerned with that. I mean, I was starting to get really uncomfortable about what was going on, but I honestly didn't really pay attention to and even look at it until it was like 2016. And I know and so I know most people in the military just didn't care. They're just like, oh, Chelsea Manning's a traitor. Good. I'm glad she's convicted. So that was my experience with it when it came out.
I remember when I was in basic training, there was a guy in my platoon who eventually went into Intel, and I remember him posting on Facebook speaking about how Julian Assange is a traitor, and he was basically saying that, look, I know we've done some bad things, but leaking classified information is still treason, while not seeing the full context that by the U.S. government committing these war crimes and sidetracking international law, that in itself is treasonous because of what it does to the United States. But going back to the Pentagon Papers, so what was inside the contents of the Pentagon Papers is one among many things what led to the Vietnam syndrome, which is, people were done with war. The paper showed the U.S. government had expanded the conflict far beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Bombing of neighborhood countries. The study revealed that the Johnson administration secretly bombed Cambodia and Laos while denying it to the American public. Lack of a clear victory strategy. The Pentagon Papers demonstrated that U.S. officials privately doubted the war could be won despite public assurances of progress. What does that sound like to you? Why does that seem like deja vu for today, at least 10 years ago?
Because it's literally deja vu for today.
Exactly.
Like we did what we came to do in Iraq. We overthrew Saddam, and then we're just like, what do we do now? And then we did what we came to do in Afghanistan. We overthrew the Taliban government and pushed them into northern Pakistan. And we were like, oh, what do we do now? 20 years later, what did we accomplish?
Yeah, exactly. And the disinformation campaigns that were used during the Vietnam War era, it became evident that multiple administrations had misled Congress and the public about the scope, objectives, and progress of the war. So, Daniel Ellsberg, the military analyst who worked on the study, became disillusioned with the war and decided to leak the documents. And in 1971, Ellsberg provided the papers to the New York Times, which began publishing excerpts on June 13th, 1971. U.S. government actually sought an injunction to stop the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers, arguing that national security was at risk. The case led to a landmark Supreme Court decision in New York Times Company versus United States, 1971, where the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspaper's right to publish, emphasizing right for freedom of press under the First Amendment. Wow, it's too bad that changed. New York Times is definitely not following in the spirit that it once did back in the 1970s. So basically, the leak eroded public trust in the U.S. government and fueled anti-war sentiment in the early 1970s. So while there was obviously anti-war sentiments going on before the leak of the Pentagon Papers basically was the validation for these concerns of the Vietnam War. So if you were to just juxtapose that for today, you see this anti-war movement and this the pro-Palestinian movement in full fervor. It's if history repeats itself, then we're obviously going to be validated probably within the next couple of years at the very least.
Yeah. So just real quick, I mean, I definitely agree with the vindication rather will happen sooner rather than later. I believe. Maybe I'm just a hopeless, idiotic optimist, but just so to give you guys a taste of what the Pentagon Papers are, what's the contents of them, how damning they really were, and just to, with a concrete example, demonstrate what Mark is saying. We are going to go into the document, and you can get this off the National Archives. If you're watching the video, you can see the website I used and the document I clicked on. So here we have top secret, sensitive, the Rolling Thunder program begins. Summary and analysis. And this is Operation Rolling Thunder was the massive sweeping bombing campaign that you referred to a couple minutes ago, Mark. So I'm just going to read this one paragraph to demonstrate basically just to give you an idea of what's in here. So, quote, summary and analysis, Operation Rolling Thunder. The United States decisions in the early months of 1965 to launch a program of reprisal airstrikes. Okay. And also, keep in mind the corollary to what Israel's doing right now. To launch a program of reprisal airstrikes against North Vietnam, evolving progressively into a sustained bombing campaign of rising intensity, were made against a background of anguished concern over the threat of imminent collapse of the government of South Vietnam and of its military effort against the Viet Cong. Yes, again, because, the South Vietnamese government was our puppet, and they had a lot of internal problems, and they were always on the brink of collapse. So they instituted this aerial bombing campaign, this saturation bombing campaign in support of the government of South Vietnam. This is before we had a massive troop presence on the ground. So the air war against the North was launched in the hope that it would strengthen the confidence and cohesion of the South Vietnamese government, and that it would deter or restrain the DRV, which is North Vietnam, from continuing its support of the Revolutionary War in the South. There was also hope, that's not the DRV. There was also hope that a quite modest bombing effort would be sufficient, that the demonstration of U.S. determination and potential risks and costs to the North implicit in the early airstrikes would provide the U.S. with substantial bargaining leverage, that it would redress the equation of advantage so that a political settlement might be negotiated on acceptable terms. This is what Israel's doing in Da'iya, Beirut right now. They are trying to bomb them into diplomatic concessions. Here we go. Final thing I'm going to read. Once set in motion, however, the bombing effort seemed to stiffen rather than soften Hanoi's backbone, as well as to lessen the willingness of Hanoi's allies, particularly the Soviet Union, to work towards compromise. But no, we're not doing that. Moreover, compromise was ruled out in any event, since the negotiating terms that the U.S. proposed were not, quote, compromise terms, but more akin to cease and desist orders. So how does that sound? Sounds exactly like U.S. policy with the ceasefire now. From the DRV Viet Cong point of view, was tantamount to a demand for their surrender. Oh my God, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So yeah, that's just a fascinating historical artifact from the Pentagon Papers. And again, that was 1965. They're already like, our strategy in Vietnam is not working. But let's keep this going for another 10 years.
Yeah. And so to jump forward, do the modern day comparison, the leaked documents from WikiLeaks, such as the Iraq war logs and Afghanistan war logs, revealed civilian casualties, human rights abuses, and unreported killings. And this is something that you can speak on more than I can, because you're more familiar with that aspect of the war in Afghanistan. So what, based on what you're personally privy to on that, and you're the expert when it comes to Afghanistan, civilian deaths in regards to drone strikes under the Obama administration, which you told me was one of the things that disillusioned you, correct? Like that was one of the biggest disillusionments when you were in the Army, was the killing of civilians through drone strikes, correct?
So yeah. Okay. First of all, I would like to say that my first deployment in 2011 was, still had most of 2010. My bad. Obama had only been in office for like 2 years, a little less than 2 years. And my first deployment was still Bush policy, Bush GWOT policy, which was actually pretty restrained at that point. Then when Obama got in office, that's when the special operation night raid tempos went up. That's when we conducted in 2011 the Afghan surge, which was wild. And then the drone strikes really ramped up. Now, you could lie to yourself. So I was in talks, like tactical operation centers, watching these drone strikes play out. I was plugged into the intelligence synchronization process and kind of had a good idea what was going on, even at a young age of like 22, 23. You could definitely lie to yourself that, we weren't actually drone striking civilians because of the word. And Josephine, who was Josephine Gilbo, friend of the show, she was a former intelligence officer, worked with the Defense Intelligence Agency, NSA, and stuff like that. And we were talking about how there's this word we have called associate or associated or affiliated. Hamas affiliates, Al-Qaeda affiliates, and what does it really affiliate mean? Because what is the information that goes behind the words your associate or your affiliate? Well, could be you're on the wrong contact list in terms of your phone number. Maybe someone was also like an informant, didn't like you because you screwed him over, or something interpersonal beef. He would tell a human intelligence collector he's associated with the Haqqani, and he wasn't. And that in combination with him being on the wrong cell phone list could lead a perfectly random civilian dude to be considered a member of the Taliban and so that's a lot of guys. We were dropping them, and because the institutional core, the institution itself was so inherently Islamophobic, nobody was really asking themselves what this means. And that was just the kind of one of the main problems that I was exposed to with kinetic strikes and JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. But there was way crazier stuff than that, based off Chelsea Manning, what she released videos of
collateral murder in 2010. It showed U.S. airstrikes killing civilians, including journalists in Iraq, for example. And it just the Afghan war logs revealed systematic failures in distinguishing between combatants and civilians. Exactly what you're saying. So I'm not too familiar with all this with Afghanistan. I've just heard from people like you, anecdotal, opinions from people like you. But all this kind of also, now that I've dived into it.
But there's also one component. We talk about drone strikes. Now let's talk about the special operations raids. Okay, this is kind of where I was like, what are we actually doing here? Because especially in like 2013, which was more of a tame deployment than like the surge in 2011, which was probably the most intense that I experienced overseas. The 2013 deployment, we were kind of like, what are we actually doing? Because I remember 5 operations in a row. We like did this offset silent infill in the mountains, like going after these quote unquote high value targets. And you conduct a direct action night raid, which we called like kill capture missions, and nothing happened because like there was no one worth anything on those targets. We basically just destroyed their house, and we're like, oh, sorry, guy we're looking for isn't really here. I guess we're gonna go home now. And I was kind of like, it's called what we call a dry hole. Bad intelligence, just chasing your own tail, not finding anything. Just worthless. $1 million of operational costs for nothing, accomplishing nothing, achieving nothing, and just risking dudes' lives because maybe there's just a random IED somewhere for what? And that's another aspect of this. Like we were conducting a lot of direct action kill capture missions with no targets to actually kill or capture. We're just literally scaring the crap out of civilians and again accomplishing nothing in 20 years.
Which leads us to the topic of what Greg and I decided on naming the GWOT syndrome, which, by the way, has not been officially named yet. This syndrome that Americans are currently in right now, which is the main point of this episode, by the way. It's not really to analyze what a war with Iran looks like. We've done episodes about that before. What we're trying to talk about in this episode is how the U.S. government is going to get Americans back on board with the idea of war, because they have a huge problem on their hands. The video that I opened this up with is very typical of the sentiments with the American people, much less combat veterans who are completely disillusioned with war and are working very hard to educate younger generations.
Okay, well, there are plenty of combat veterans who are not disillusioned with war who are totally championing a war with Iran. We just have to say that for the sake of fairness and everything.
Glad you said that, because a key example of what you just said would be somebody like Tim Kennedy. I used to regularly watch Joe Rogan podcast, and he would often have combat veterans like Sean Ryan and Tim Kennedy. I used to like Sean Ryan because at first I was thinking this guy is anti-war, he's anti-imperialist, but he's really not. He's ex-CIA, and he's kind of playing this whole xenophobic play on getting Americans paranoid of an invasion by immigrants, right? That appears to be his role. Now, Tim Kennedy was on Joe Rogan podcast and was complaining that we don't have a lot of young men who are joining special operations, who are joining the screening process, like RASP, like Ranger Regiment, or trying to get into special forces, because the people who would qualify for that with the physical standards that's required for such elite forces, they're not joining the Army. They're not joining the Marines. So the U.S. government has a huge problem on its hands. People don't want to sign up for war. There are better things to do with their lives. So how do they conquer that? We've as George Bush Sr. bragged by getting us into the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. He officially bragged that he had conquered the Vietnam syndrome. But now we're dealing with a much more potent syndrome, the GWOT syndrome.
Yeah, but hang on. I need to give the actual quote, because it's
give the actual quote.
It's creepily like pseudo poetic. The quick victory during the Gulf War was widely believed to be the end of the Vietnam syndrome. As you just mentioned, George Bush triumphantly declared after the war, quote, "The ghosts of Vietnam have been laid to rest beneath the sands of the Arabian desert."
Yep.
Yeah.
These guys were George Bush Sr. and his son very much thought in romantic terms when it came to war. They saw war as their legacy to be recorded in the annals of history with names like Alexander the Great. This is the kind of people they were. Whereas warmongers today are more or less concerned with profit margins, more or less, So that's my assessment, anyways. When it comes to the personality types that we're dealing with today compared to the 1990s and early 2000s. So Ronald Reagan, though, before George Bush Sr., he asserted that he sought to bury the Vietnam syndrome by reasserting American strength abroad. But it still didn't work. Like you mentioned, the invasion of Grenada in 1983 was in part an attempt to restore confidence in military interventions.
Yeah, it worked. It worked. They hoped the success of the invasion of Grenada would help dispel the Vietnam syndrome. So, I think that one of the main concerns was we're not really going to get into this. It's just the invasion of Grenada is interesting for me because it's like a big part of Ranger unit history that when I was going through the indoctrination program, the selection process, we learned about because it was the Rangers who jumped into the airfield to rescue like the 1,000 U.S. citizens trapped in the airport. Operation Urgent Fury, learned all about that one. But the thing about that is what Reagan did, and this is kind of what happened in the global war on terror, is that he didn't go to Congress to ask permission. They just used executive powers to do it because they're worried about a leak, like a Pentagon paper-esque leak where someone within the Department of Defense would leak this invasion plan and tell it to send it to the New York Times again and be like, this is about to be Vietnam 2.0. But I guess Operation Urgent Fury was successful. It was a nice PR check mark, and it was a small engagement. It wasn't like a massive war, and it looked like an American success. So check mark, Vietnam syndrome over with. Combine that with Desert Storm, which was obviously a military victory against Saddam's military, one of the most powerful militaries on the planet at that point. Boom, Vietnam syndrome over with. Now we can go into the GWOT.
So you spoke about how, let's talk about Donald Trump. We got to get to this subject. We got to hit this because this is the most important part. So my theory that I proposed to Greg on Friday, because I've been thinking about how I try to put myself in the government's shoes. If I were the government, how would I get the U.S. public on board with a war with Iran again? The problem with the American public today as compared to the 1970s is that we are no longer as much a monolith. 1970s, we were more of, or 1960s and 50s, we were more of a monolith because all you had to do was control the radio, television, and newspapers. And if you put out the right headline, everybody's reading the same headlines, and you can kind of steer public opinion that way and public sentiments. But nowadays, you got the internet, you got social media, you got the truth that's leaking everywhere. So people are all kind of scattering in their own different ways. Sentiments are becoming decentralized in our society. So how do you collect all these sheep in one pen to get them on board with something, one action? You can't really do it these days, but you can try. And so far, one of the biggest chunks of public sentiments is the fervor surrounding Donald J. Trump. The American public, while he doesn't have a huge chunk of the American public, he has enough to, I guess, qualify as somewhat of a monolith. And that goes back to my theory about why Trump is now speaking on terms of going to war with Iran and striking Iran. This is.
Do you have the video? You pulled up the video, right?
I do. But I first want to get your opinion on you were saying something very interesting the other day about how Trump is not anti-war. We have this perception that he's anti-war. His base has a perception that he's anti-war.
He's anti-sub wars.
He's anti-sub wars. So, but to go into that more, because he's come out publicly as being against the war in Ukraine. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, you see a lot of war hawking that bubbles up.
Okay, so first of all, he's not anti-war. He's anti-some wars, specifically the war in Ukraine. Everybody knows that he's a Putin fanboy. He wants to be seen and revered like Putin is, as you know, with a strong man with some authoritarian tendencies. and he wants a seat at the table. He wants a seat at the strongman table. And look, I know there's a lot of complicated feelings about Putin, especially with this audience. So we're just going to leave that to the side. But he says that he could end the war in Ukraine before he even gets into office. And then Foreign Minister Lavrov, Blinken's counterpart in Russia, who's way more competent than Blinken, said, no, you can't. The war in Ukraine is not ending in a week, even if Trump's in office. But he is against that war. He wants to end it. And I think we would see it end eventually. Now, is he against the war in Iran with Iran? Well, not necessarily. So during his presidency, don't pull that up. Okay. During his presidency, a Global Hawk, this massive aerial surveillance platform, it costs like $200 million. Don't quote me on that, but it's a lot. And he got shot down by Iranian air defense systems, right? And so he wanted to, and it apparently enraged him. It enraged Trump. So he wanted to strike all of these air defense sites in reprisal for the Iranians shooting down the Global Hawk, which was apparently in their airspace. And so he went to the Pentagon. He's like, let's do this. And then generals of the Pentagon were like, okay, Mr. President, are you sure you want to do this? Because if we strike their sites, they will respond and it will start off a chain of escalation that will level our gas, our oil interests in the region, expose our bases to reprisal, shut down the Strait of Hormuz and the massive channel of energy that supplies Europe and, to a lesser extent, North America and the rest of the world. And it will cause this global conflict, mostly economic, of dimensions that nobody can predict, but we can do it. Are you sure, Mr. President? And then he said no, just because the war with Iran looks so crazy. And that was, what was reportedly done. But that doesn't mean he's anti-war with Iran. It just means he wasn't prepared at that moment to pull the trigger on a chain of events that could basically cause a 1920-esque global recession.
Yeah. So, given all that we've debunked that whole theory that Trump is anti-war.
He dropped more ordnance. He dropped more ordnance in Afghanistan than Obama did.
Yeah.
Just because he wanted us out of Syria, and he wanted us out of Syria because he wanted, to be buddies with Putin, who in the Russian army was trying to, was backing up the Assad regime. And so, there's a lot of personal reasons why he went out of Syria. He's a vain, narcissistic man. But just because he wanted to pull out of Syria does not mean, again, he's anti-war. He's anti-war when Putin's involved.
Yeah. So given the challenge that we have now in the GWOT syndrome, and I go back to my theory that the only way you can get some chunk of demographics on board with war again is through Trump. He's kind of like the only vector for which public sentiment can kind of coalesce around a single person, which leads to a very crazy attempt at getting his base on board the war after his close call back in July, I believe, with the assassin, the would-be assassin. A lot of people were wondering, well, what's the background of the shooter? And Trump has come out. He came out on the Andrew Schultz podcast, which was probably a smart move on his part because Andrew Schultz has more like a millennial audience, whereas traditionally war hawking has been kind of aimed at like the boomer generation. So on Andrew Schultz's podcast, they were asking him, well, who's behind the shooting? And after a lot of delaying and rambling, Trump finally reveals that he thinks it was the Iranians. And I started doing a Google search because I feel like whenever you Google something, if you want to know what the system wants you to start thinking about, just look at the top Google results. And the things that they don't want you thinking about, they're going to be buried. this is true with the entire pro-Palestinian movement. If you want to find out what Israel is doing, you're not going to really find it on the top Google results. You're going to see a lot of apologist articles. Well, if you Google Donald Trump assassin Iran, you're just going to be flooded. The whole thing is taken up by articles talking about how Iran might be behind Donald Trump's attempted assassination, and how Donald Trump is requesting extra security from the Biden administration because he's put on a hit list. This, to me, is their desperate attempt to maybe get a large chunk of Americans on board with a war in Iran, because Iran is threatening their Messiah. So that's my theory, and it's just they're grasping at straws. It's a Hail Mary to try and see if they can get something that they can coalesce around that will anger Americans enough to want to get them on board the war with Iran. And a lot of Americans think that Donald Trump is the second coming, and so I guess in their mind, they might be thinking that, well, if we push this narrative that Iran is trying to assassinate their Messiah, maybe that will do it, right?
Well, what's interesting is it's not just, the conservative establishment like demonizing Iran. Trump has always had a problem with Iran. That's why he put in Mike Pompeo, Christian evangelicus Zionist psycho, an anti-Iran war hawk in charge of the CIA when he was president. It's always been this neoconservative, now neoliberal fever dream to bomb Iran, to institute a regime change ever since the Shah, who we installed, was overthrown in 1979 during the popular revolution, and the Ayatollahs were installed. So there's always been this idea that Iran is weak. It's a post-revolutionary state on the brink of collapse. We just, their currency is failing. Their military is a paper tiger. And, this was
at the same time, they're the greatest threat. At the same time, they're this monolithic octopus that spreads throughout the world, wreaking havoc with their unlimited resources.
Yeah.
So it's catch-22.
Axis of terror. Well, it justifies whatever foreign policy position that we want to take with Iran. It justifies it because they're so dangerous we have to attack, and they're also so weak that an attack would be successful. It's why we've had them under sanctions for decades. Because sanctions basically work to cause a certain living situation, economic situation that was so desperate for people that they will rise up and overthrow their own government. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. The sanctions didn't work. Nothing's worked. So yes, they do want to manufacture consent for a war with Iran, and making Trump this messiah figure, and that he was trying to be assassinated with Iran. Then you have Kamala Harris saying Iran's our biggest threat. It does seem like they're trying to get over the GWOT syndrome, because, again, and I need to say this, Iran, again, has always been this fever dream of destroying the regional hegemon, because America cannot tolerate non-allied regional hegemons. Like, it's a threat to U.S. imperialist interests, and Iran is that, because it was born out of a reaction to a U.S. coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, their democratically elected leader and stuff, and that's beyond the scope of this. But it's long been this foreign policy position that this regime needs to go, and sanctions didn't work, right? What happens if sanctions don't work? Military intervention. But we're not at a place where we can do that. Not militarily, not actually, but maybe in theory. Here's the thing. When you say they're grasping at straws, I completely agree. They are grasping at straws. We're not in a position to fight Iran. There's no political will to. However, what is Iran really? It's the one power in the region that can put a check on Israeli impunity. It's really it. And of course, Iran would never invade Israel, and Israel would never invade Iran. They don't have the capacity to do that. However, they could fight a distance conflict that would be mutually devastating for both countries.
Yeah.
And so when I hear this talk of, bombing Iran, maybe fighting them in the future. I don't really believe it. It's just manufacturing consent for supporting Israel no matter what to the hilt. I don't see an actual war between the United States and Iran happening. And I think the GWOT syndrome is still in place.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. We need Iran to be the boogeyman. We need them to be able to say, Israel's our greatest ally in the region. They're fighting Iran and all their terror proxies. And if we don't support them and Israel ceases to exist and can no longer fight the terrorists for us, they're going to come over to the United States and kill us. Like that's the crux of this language. I don't think they actually intend to go to war or invade, because again, we're not in a position to do it. But
yeah, we can't invade. That's impossible. It would be proxy wars. It would be bombing campaign over the, what do they call it? Over the horizon bombing campaigns.
Yeah.
So right. So the, I guess, but then I pushed back on you and Travis at a previous episode when we were talking about the possible intentions behind this and how it might connect to the pro-fracking sentiments with the pro-fracking ideologies of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. As we know, during the debate, they were having a competition on who's more pro-fracking. I posit the theory, whether it sounds conspiratorial or not. I don't think it's conspiratorial. I just think it's
that's why we bring you on to check the conspiracy theorist boxes for some of our viewers.
Good. I'm glad I'm the Fox Mulder of this podcast. Yeah. But I posit the theory that at least a over the horizon bombing campaign war against Iran, like you said, it would shut down the Strait of Hormuz, in which case you said that they would then take out the oil refining capacity of Saudi Arabia and everybody else in the region, thus completely crippling the oil output of that entire region. And that would basically give U.S. oil companies, energy companies, complete hegemony over the energy market. And so I told you and Travis that who really makes the decisions for international, for international policy is not the Pentagon, it's not the White House, it's Wall Street. Because if there was a complete crippling of Saudi Arabia and Iran's energy capacity, then that would make the world reliant on American oil. And we do have larger oil reserves than anybody else on the planet. Now, that could completely be wrong. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I have to put it out there because it could be a definite possibility. And it does appear to be adding up to that. I just have to put it out there. I don't want to delve more into that, but I just at least want to put it on the table in case that is what's going on.
You put it on the table. Now, I'm going to have to address one thing about that. Yeah. Of course, a lot of United States and like British Petroleum would make potentially a ton of money. But then again, there's the other thing about like the entire global markets crashing again into 1920s fuckery. So like, would that actually be a net gain for those capitalist interests? And again, ExxonMobil and all these oil companies, they have other interests than just energy. And they're part of they're connected to like hedge funds, which are also in big pharma and tech and all these other things that would suffer from the global economy spiraling. So, and then you'd have other countries in the future being able to like break away from the petrodollar and stuff like that. I don't see the economic net gain for big energy by actually doing that or actually forcing that to happen.
Okay, well, let's talk about BRICS for a second. The growing fear that we're constantly hearing about is that we have BRICS and that it's eventually the petrodollar is going to lose its status. And
it's going to take a long time.
Okay, but if that were true, and if I were, the CEOs of these energy companies, I would want one way to, I guess, regain the hegemony of the petrodollar would be to completely, disable whatever oil capacity that region of the world has and make it reliant on American oil, in which case we can say, no, you're buying it in American dollars. there's no way you're going to be able to go over to any type of currency, because now you're not able to produce. It's going to take years for you to rebuild your oil capacity. You got to rely on us. So it would be a great counter to the BRICS if they wanted to. But again, all theory, it's whatever. I am not married to this theory. It's just I have to put it out there.
Okay,
but that being said,
here's the deal with that. And here's my problem with that. Okay, United States unipolarity, its unipolar power, its source of power also comes from its like vassal states in Europe. Europe already has a massive energy crisis from the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, a bunch of other stuff, other factors. That's why they're trying to build that new Silk Road, the Mumbai cross Saudi through Cyprus trade corridor. It's partly to do with energy.
And the Gaza marine, but think about it.
Yeah.
Think about it. This is where it relates to Gaza, though. This is where Gaza comes in.
Okay, well, hang on. Let me finish my point. So, okay. Sure, America has these massive oil reserves and stuff, but like, what's the logistical timeline of being able to send that to Europe? Like, Europe would be in fucking free fall if the global oil market just went down the drain. Like, and that again is a major source of the United States political power. So it's just way more. It's just way more complicated than some oil companies about to make some money.
I'm not saying just make some money. It's not just about making money. It's about making them reliant on us, which adds all types of hegemony after that. Like you have the power of the energy companies, but you also just simply have the power that comes out of that. It's bigger than just energy. And I would say that if Europe gets crippled, doesn't seem like the United States cares about that either because of the Nord Stream, the conspiracy theories surrounding the Nord Stream oil gas pipeline, and just how we're fueling this war. We're using Ukraine as so carelessly. We're stoking. We've been stoking on this war in Ukraine so carelessly. It doesn't appear that we care about European security or the security of the European Union. It doesn't appear that we have that in our interest. And plus, it would also make the European Union reliant on us even more. So
they already are.
I don't know.
They already are.
Yeah, exactly. And
so why would we need to do that? Why they're already completely relying on us. They're like NATO is only viable because it's backed by the U.S. military. Like I don't know. They're already relying on us. Like completely.
Yeah. And it would be on steroids if this happened. Now, this also takes us to Gaza.
But they'd also be so crippled that what would their point be to us? So all I'm saying that there's a lot of different dimensions to this. I don't think a war with Iran would happen because it's too insane. I don't think anybody would profit. And that's why the United States has been trying to de-escalate with Iran, supporting Israel as much as it can, but not getting directly involved as of yet. Again, we're sending troops to Israel, but they're for air defense systems. It's just one THAAD battery. So I guess GWOT syndrome still in place, but also even if it wasn't, like, we're not in a position to go to war anyways. This is no longer the 90s.
Of course.
Okay. This is no longer the 90s when we had this military capacity and power projection. We were just too scared to use it because of Vietnam. It's kind of reversed now. The GWOT syndrome is we destroyed ourselves and our military capacity for 20 years fighting a mostly low intensity counterinsurgency, and we're not only are we now scared to use it, like anyone who knows anything is scared to use it, but we're also don't have the same power projections that we had in the 90s. We're not as capable as we were. Yes, we have fancier stuff, but so does everybody. So what's the deal here? We're trying to isolate Russia with the war in Ukraine. We're trying to isolate and contain China with Taiwan and some other stuff going on with Japan and South China Sea.
We're stretched too thin. We can't.
And it's not working. It's just not working. And so I think if the GWOT syndrome still exists, it's not really a threat to actually going to war. All right, so let's wrap up.
But I don't think that I don't think they're going to be able to conquer the GWOT syndrome. However, let's keep an eye out for attempts to do that. We have to, I think if anything, like a call to action, I guess, with the audience would be, talk to your right wingers, talk to your right wing friends over at the bar, and let them know, hey, they're going to try all kinds of little gimmicks to get people on board with war again. Could be Trump coming out there and saying, hey, they're definitely trying to kill me. But just I'm constantly going to be putting my brain on what they might be trying to do to get us back on board with war. And I think that if there is something that we can do as the audience, that would actually have an effect in combating this, is just simply reach out to right wingers and tell them, hey, look, they may be trying to do something to get you back on board with war. Keep your eyes out for it.
I don't know. I don't know any right wingers anymore.
Oh, well, you gotta change that, man. We gotta start doing. We gotta start being going on the offensive here with our propaganda. And back to the energy real quick. We have to keep in mind. We have to go back to the whole thing about the Gazan natural gas basin. The reserves off the coast of Gaza. If we get the West Asia oil capacity, energy capacity gets crippled, it would also make Europe reliant on Israel for natural gas, which could also be part of the grand scheme of things. I don't know. We have to throw these possibilities out there, even if they're wrong, because one of them might be right, and it's at least beneficial that we're aware of them. So, anyways,
no, man, I always listen to your theories.
Do you though?
I mean, I listen.
You fucking dick. All right.
So, all right, guys. Well, okay. All right. So, sorry, I got derailed by amusing myself with that. 1 second. I was going to say, finally, that U.S. foreign policy hasn't changed. If you look at the Vietnam papers or the Pentagon papers, sorry, in the Vietnam backlash. And then you look at the global war on terror and the WikiLeaks and Julian Assange drama. Our foreign policy, how we do things, really hasn't changed in any substantive way. What has changed is U.S. power projection, both economically and militarily. And I think that's eventually what's going to end the empire, because we're just going to destroy
the public sentiments has changed. That's one thing that we do have going for us, is that we have the power of outreach more than ever, because we didn't own newspapers back in the 1970s. We didn't own the cable companies. We didn't own the news stations, but we do own our Facebook pages, our Instagram pages, and our TikTok channels. And that is proving to be more lethal than any cable company out there, as we are seeing. So that is a victory that we are winning. And I suggest that the audience keep it up, because that we are winning on that front, and the government does not know what to do about it. They are coming up with all kinds of ways to do it, to conquer that and conquer the GWOT syndrome. It ain't working, and I love it. Let's keep that up. Let's figure out ways to keep that up. Anyways,
yeah. So, okay, hell yeah, brother. So
right on, man.
I think, in closing, I do think the GWOT syndrome is real. I think that's why we're no longer going to put boots on the ground, at least for a hot minute. And that's why this Iranian boogeyman is just a talking point to manufacture consent to keep supporting Israel no matter what. That's one of the reasons, because, again, they're the only power in the region that can check their impunity, and we need to support them, I guess. Otherwise, terrorism will come to your doorstep through illegal immigrants from Guatemala. God damn it.
Yes. What do you think about Iran? Would you hit Iran? And he goes, as long as they don't hit the nuclear stuff. That's the thing you want to hit, right? I said, I think he's got that one wrong. Is that what you're supposed to hit? I mean, it's the biggest risk we have. Nuclear weapons, the power of nuclear weapons, the power of weaponry. You know, I rebuilt the entire military. Beautiful jets, everything. I built it, including nuclear, and I hated to build the nuclear, but I got to know firsthand the power of that stuff. And I'll tell you what, we have to be totally prepared. We have to be absolutely prepared. But when they asked him that question, the answer should have been hit the nuclear first and worry about the rest later.
Hit
your anti-war presidential candidate, guys.
Hit the nukes first, worry about the rest later. That is U.S. foreign policy in a nutshell. All right, thanks, guys, so much. I don't think World War III is going to happen yet, but been wrong before, probably be wrong again. So we'll see you later on in the week. Thanks so much for listening.